Okay, guys, so last week we looked at the difference between immediate and deferred gratification and some theories on why, let's say, the working class, for example, attend to the more immediate gratification rather than deferred gratification. Not necessarily that's the theory that I believe in, or that's that's widely credited, but this is an argument that has been made previously. So we looked at that. What I wanted you to look at last week was to understand these kind of roots of how poverty or lower income leads to a number of different outcomes in life, and so why life expectancy is something that's affected by this. And this week we're going to go a little bit deeper into social inequality and talk about wealth and income specifically. So, in some societies, in some places, there are measures in place to try and reduce inequality. What do we mean by inequality? The inequality between groups in a stratification of society. In this case, we want to look at the inequality between the richest people in a society and the poorest people. A more equal society would have a smaller gap between them. But again, that's easier said than done in many places. So what do we mean by wealth? So this means financial savings, things that can be bought and sold, not just money. So for example, someone might own lots of houses, or lots of office buildings, jewelry, gold, stocks and shares in companies. So there might be some people who have lots of money in that sense, but they don't have it in their bank account. They're still wealthy. So this is what we mean by wealth. So money, savings, and property that can be bought and sold to generate income. Okay. Now, having all these things is an indicator of social class. So some of these forms of wealth create more wealth. Okay. So if you have shares, you get money from those shares every year. If you have like collectibles, like artwork, things like that, they can grow in value, over time. So the argument is that the very wealthy don't need to work because their wealth creates more wealth. There is an argument in today's society that the more money you have, the more money you can make. Perfect example of this is someone like Donald Trump. He claims that he's a self-made man, but he inherited, I think, $30 million from his dad. So he didn't start off poor, but he used the money he had to get even richer. And often this is inherited. So the wealthy have not acquired their wealth themselves, but it's been passed down to them by their parents or other relatives. So a lot of people who are privately wealthy had families who were already wealthy. That's not always the case, but that tends to be the fact. So somewhere like the UK, wealth is very unequal. So the wealthiest 10% of adults own about 40% of the wealth, and the least wealthy 10% have about 1% of the wealth. So basically, almost, put it this way, almost half of the money in the UK is owned or made by only 10% of the people. Yeah, think about that for a second. Almost half of the money in the UK is owned by only 10% of the people. The lowest 10% only own 1% of the wealth. Yeah. So there is a big gap between the very rich and the very poor. And this hasn't changed. If anything, you might argue that this is actually getting worse. So you can have a look here at a map of the UK, for example. Okay. And from looking at this map, what do you notice? Where are the kind of the wealthiest areas on the map? So you want to be looking at the dark orange areas. And where are the, let's say, the poorest areas? Yeah. So generally what you find is that the wealthiest areas tend to be in the south over here. Now, London itself was interesting because why do you think London, even though it's the capital of the country, even though it has some of the richest people in the world, not just in England, why do you think London itself is not, on average, the wealthiest region? So some of the reasons for that could be, again, that we looked at. So within a big city, you have an inner city. There are lots of people who come to the city for work, are actually quite poor, are on working minimum wage. and don't have a great share of household wealth. So you find this in big cities that not necessarily that they're that wealthy. Whereas if you go to towns and villages in the southwest and the southeast, generally there's a higher level of income. People tend to move there and buy land there if they are privately wealthy, a little bit wealthier. Okay. So despite this, there are large numbers of people in modern industrial societies who do have wealth. Yeah, most people have bank accounts. Some people invest. Some households have consumer durables. Yeah, even people who, let's say, may claim to be poor, you might see them with again, consumer electronics. The cost of um, forms of entertainment, TVs, computers, things like that, have come down. Yeah, so more people can access them now, for example. But if you notice, during this corona outbreak, if you follow the news, there are many people who are out of work and have not got enough savings. Yeah, they live month to month, and there are a lot of people in this situation. So that basically they have been pushed into poverty because of this situation, because they can't work or they may have lost their jobs. But going back to wealth, what other forms of wealth do you have? Housing, land. So people who own their own houses, if you own your house, that is a form of wealth for you. You can't turn it into money until you sell it. That's a problem for some people, but technically, that's part of your wealth. You also have pensions. So you have basically, it's if you work for a long time, every month you put there's some money put aside for you, and it's invested for you. And then when you retire, you're able to collect all of this money. You get like a big sum of money, and then you get some money every year. So people who retire look forward to this. So again, it's kept in your pension fund, so you can't use it until you get to a certain age. So you have to basically make sure you don't die before then, and you're able to survive until then. So you have to wait a long time to get that pension. There are also shares. So you might invest in a business, but these can go up and down. You could lose a lot of money on these as well. So, for example, again, during this corona outbreak, there are many people who invested, and their shares have gone down in value because the stock markets have gone down quite a lot since this corona outbreak. I think the UK stock exchange has gone down 25%, yeah, which is the lowest it's been for over 20 years. Yeah, so that is also a risk. So a lot of people have lost a lot of money through that too. So that's wealth. But then income, what actually comes in for people's income? Now, usually from employment, from salary. But if you don't have a job, this is taking the UK and many European countries as an example, you will have something called social security. So you might get some payments from the state. If you have children, you might get child benefit, or unemployment benefit to help you while you look for work. Or you might get interest or dividends on shares. So there are other forms of income that you have to pay, but these are taxed or deducted. So if you get a paycheck in England, you will have to pay something called national insurance, and this goes towards again, your health care and other things like that. So it's not free in a country like England. You are paying tax to get these services. And then what you have left is something called disposable income. The amount of money you get afterwards is what you can spend your money on. So again, obviously, it makes sense. If you have a higher income, that affects your life chances. So the UK is becoming more unequal in this way. But if you have wealth, you're able to access the best education, the best healthcare, or private healthcare. You don't have to rely on the state government services to do that. And you can see how these gaps, as they form, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. But there are different countries who have different ways of dealing with this. So the UK is one example, but there are other countries who have something called a welfare state. So some countries, the government tries to help people who are poor, and the aim of that is to reduce social inequality. So if you help people in that position, you give them a better life chance of improving their standards of life and improving their children's standards of life. And this tended to happen, let's say, in the last part, the last century, in England in particular, after the Second World War. This was something, there was a free health service that was created, the NHS for everyone, and other kinds of benefits that helped people. So, for example, so there are some countries where inequality is smaller. So Japan, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. So in those countries, the richest 20% of people are 4 times richer than the poorest 20%. If you compare that to somewhere like Singapore, the richest are about 10 times richer, and the US are about 8 times richer. So the gap between the richest and poorest people in these countries is smaller. Although you might say in Singapore and USA, they might have more very, very rich people, or the richest people in those countries are much richer than the richest in these countries, but the gap between the rich and poor is smaller in these countries. So there have been studies on this. Wilkinson Pickett looked at this in 2010. Their argument is many aspects of society are decided not by how wealthy a country is, but how equal or unequal it is. Now, we have a perfect example of this in Qatar, where we live. And if you compare, it's officially the wealthiest country in the world by GDP, which means by output, by how much money the country makes. But if you look at people's salaries, yeah, there is a big difference between salaries somewhere like Qatar, where the minimum wage is much lower than somewhere like in the UK or in other European countries. So I would ask you if you think, although Qatar is a rich country, is it an equal society? Is it more or less equal than the countries I've mentioned here? But what happens is when there is a gap between rich and poor people, you tend to see these kind of things. So you might see physical and mental health and obesity issues, yeah, in the poorest populations. The education performance, again, the standard of education, the quality of education, you might see students leaving school earlier, if they're from a poor background. They may be more involved in crime, violent crime, joining gangs, for example, more likely to, let's say, go to prison, yeah, for certain communities. And this is important, the lack of opportunities for social mobility, which means basically, if you're born into a certain situation, it's hard for you to move up the chain. Remember, we looked at this when we looked at the feudal system, the caste system, and the estate system. It's a modern day version of this. If these things aren't addressed, so the negative consequences apply to those at the higher end. Yeah. So actually, an argument that's made is that if you have a more equal society, that means it benefits the rich people in society as well. Because if everyone has a chance to live, if everyone has a chance to have a basic income and a basic rights, then everyone is happy. Yeah. If that isn't the case, you may have higher rates of crime, and the richest people in society might become targets for the poorest. So actually, greater equality benefits everyone. Because let's say you're a rich person who own a business, you want people to spend money, you want people to buy products. But if your workers can't afford to buy the products that you're making, you're not going to make as much money. But if everyone has enough money to actually afford to buy goods and services, then the economy gets much stronger. Yeah, so it's in everyone's interest to do that. That's what some people would argue. Okay. So what happens is welfare states, what they look at is how do they actually affect this? How do they change this inequality? So they don't see inequality as a problem in itself. Maybe it's inevitable. Maybe it's impossible to get true equality. Now, some communist countries tried this, but it's very difficult to actually achieve. Okay. So what governments see is they would see their country as a meritocracy. Okay, this is the key word here. In a meritocracy, I remember from school you might have got merits. Yeah, if you did some good work, if you did your homework on time. Yeah, if you did an outstanding job in your sociology homework for Mr. Neil, he may have given you a merit. Yeah, a merit is something that you get for your hard work. So a meritocracy is like a society. Yeah, how people are rewarded according to talent and effort. If they deserve praise, if they deserve a high salary, if they deserve a job, they will get that job. This is meritocratic. Yeah. So the argument is that you might be born poor, you might be born without, all the tools there, but if you work hard enough, you will get to the top. Yeah. Um, so governments need to try and make sure, that they help people and they help society become meritocratic. So individuals can achieve the level that their talents and abilities deserve. So, what do they do in modern industrial states to do this? So, they take responsibility for security and well-being of citizens. Okay, so you pay tax. Okay, obviously in Qatar we don't pay tax, but in the UK you would pay tax. And to this tax, so every time you get your salary from your job, the government takes some money from you, and that goes towards providing how education, so it pays for schools, it pays for teachers' salaries, it goes towards hospitals. Yeah, so if you're sick, you get your healthcare paid for, and it pays for your council services. Yeah, so even if you live in a house and there is a service to take away the trash from your house, yeah, or the people, or to fix the roads where you live, things like this come from your taxes. Um, but there are also charities, religious organizations, and other groups that provide welfare as well. So the government can't provide everything or doesn't provide everything. So there are also other means of providing support and assistance as well. Okay. Um, but why were they introduced? Because welfare states were not always around. This is quite a modern thing that we're doing. Many societies didn't have this before. The poor lived in very bad conditions and were given no help. But in modern times, many countries have introduced this welfare state. So it could be seen as something moral. Many people think it's wrong if you let someone live in poor conditions, in complete poverty. Other people get rich, and you do nothing to help these poor people. Um, it's something that many people see as immoral. If you look at any religion, in all religions, there is some reference to helping the poor, supporting the poor, trying to help others. Now, if every major religion on earth says this, then you could say this is a moral imperative. This is something that we should all do. We should help um, poor people to try and succeed, give them a fair chance. The other thing is political. Now, in a cynical way, you could say, if there are many poor people in society, now in a democracy, everyone votes for who they want to lead the country. So a political party, a politician, would have to try and come up with some ideas and some solutions for poor people. Otherwise, poor people wouldn't vote for them. Yeah. So a functionalist would say that welfare needs to maintain society's value system. Yeah, because otherwise the poor will revolt against the rich. Now you saw this. This was in the French Revolution. This is what happened. You had an aristocracy. You had a monarchy. Kings and queens who ruled the country, and lords who took all the money from the people working on their land. And the poor people became very angry about this, and decided to do something about it, and decided to chop off the heads of the ruling class. And ever since then, there has been no monarchy, no king or queen in France. But even, let's say, in the UK, for example, now the Conservative Party, party that's in charge now, appealed to voters, poorer voters, and they made some promises to them. I won't, apologize for my allegiances that I'm not a Conservative voter, and I see this as some, let's say, manipulation on some level of the poorest people in society, because the Conservative Party in England generally has been a party for the very wealthy, the very rich, and of course they wouldn't be able to sell their ideas as only supporting the very rich people in society, they would need to give something, some arguments for the poorest people in society. Otherwise, why would they vote for them? So in some ways, a welfare state is political, yeah, because if you don't do anything for the poorest people in society, they're not going to vote for you. You're not going to be popular with them. So you kind of need to do this in a way, because there are less people who are very rich than there are people who are poor, or so it just makes sense in that sense. Yeah. So either it's a moral imperative, you're doing the right thing, or it's political. That you basically you need to score political points to do this. So there are some countries that are kind of world leaders in this. So the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Finland, these have very strong welfare states. So they have good public transport, they have free healthcare for all their citizens, childcare as well. In these countries, childcare is either very cheap or provided by the government. In many countries, it's very expensive to get childcare. If you have a baby, young child, you're not able to do this. But in these countries, they make it very affordable. For example, in Sweden, a friend of mine, her daughter was in nursery, and they paid 100 euros a month. So basically, let's say 400 reals, 500 reals a month. If you were in the UK, the same full-time childcare would cost almost 7 or 8 times more than it would in Sweden. There's a big difference. You also get free education in these countries. So if you wanted to, all the way up to university, if you wanted to do a university degree, a master's, or a doctorate, it would be paid for by the state. Yeah. So again, there are lots of benefits to this. But what happens here? How do they get all these things? It doesn't come for free. You are taxed quite highly in these countries. So if you work in these countries, your tax rate is actually higher than many other places. But generally, most people are happy with this arrangement in these countries because they get so many things from the government for this. But that's not the case in all countries. For example, we don't have tax in Qatar, but we still get many amenities because of the wealth of the country. So in other places, you get these social democratic parties. So certain political parties are more in favor of this. And what they see is that the welfare state is a way to reduce class struggles. So all the wealth and power that's with the upper classes, they want to distribute this more fairly in society. So actually some of that wealth and power can be spread across the classes. So somewhere like in Scandinavia, they have universal benefits. If you lose a job, you get a little bit of money just to help you, while you're looking, or maybe if you're renting somewhere, the government will help you with your rent until you find a job. If you have a disability, you're paid an allowance. Yeah, you don't necessarily have to go back to work, but you're paid something to help you in this situation. You know, in the USA, for example, you might get food vouchers. This is one thing that they're doing at the moment. Again, just to help you in these kind of situations. If you go to school and you're from a poor background, you might get something like free school meals. Yeah, so you might get your food for free at school if you're from a poor background, for example. Yeah. So this, you could say, is almost Marxist in its view, isn't it? It's almost Marxist because it's a way of redistributing wealth by class struggle. Yeah. Now, I mentioned the USA. I'll mention it again, and actually, it's a kind of different system. It provides a safety net for the most needy, whereas European models tend to reduce inequality. The US system, will help people at the most vulnerable. However, it's many people criticize the American approach to this because for such a wealthy nation, many people feel that they could do much more for the poorest in their society. Going back to the UK, the welfare state actually was just before World War One, so in the early 1900s. So that's when they started with pensions and national insurance. So people would put money into this fund, and anyone who is sick or unemployed would get a little bit of money just to help them through. And then after World War II, then they had free universal education, free national health service, extended benefits, pensions, and affordable housing by the government as well. So there were many things introduced after World War II. So some were means tested. So the idea of means testing is you only people who really need it would get this income, whereas some of them were just given to everyone as well. So there are two different ways of doing that. So here are some kind of demographics of how this works, how much money is given in benefits in the UK. It does take up a large chunk of the budget. However, there are bigger chunks of the budget than just the benefit system as well. So what one clash we have now is many people on the right wing think that the welfare state costs too much money, it's too expensive, and it creates a culture of dependency. So where people lose the ability to look after themselves, they become dependent on welfare. So there are cases like this in UK, for example, where there's generations of the same family who have lived on benefits, and then their children have also lived on benefits and not been in full-time work. Now, this is an issue. You want the benefits to help people and the most needy and vulnerable, but people criticize the UK model, saying that actually there's no incentive for some people to go to work because after all their taxes are paid for and their rent and everything else, for them to go to work, they wouldn't have much more money than they would if they just stayed on benefits. So you have to find the right balance between helping people in a situation of need, but also giving them an incentive to actually go back to work. Um, so you see this in 2010. The conservative government that came in, they said we needed austerity. Many benefits had to be cut. And this was very controversial. I mean, I will tell you this is controversial because I worked with many people who claimed these benefits. Now, there were people who were genuinely disabled, people who genuinely could not work because of illness and were forced to go to work. Otherwise, the government would cut their benefits. There were lots of horrible stories where people had actually fallen very ill. Some people had actually died because of their conditions because they were forced to go to work when really, they weren't healthy enough to do it. So there's been huge criticism of this. Now, even now, there are many people out of work because of the coronavirus, and people are waiting months to get paid because their employers haven't paid them. The government has introduced something to help them for the next few months, but this causes a big, big problem. And there are many people who are critical about these tests because people who genuinely cannot work are being forced into work and their benefits are being cut very strictly, and they have to reapply for these benefits. And many people go, let's say, 1 month without any payments and are kicked out of their homes, suffer a lot of stress and distress about this, and it causes a big problem. They get into debt because of this. So it has to be managed very carefully as well. So what might the right wingers say? The welfare state encourages a something for nothing dependency. Welfare payments become too generous, like I mentioned before, and it's also expensive. Yeah, because it provides more people when it should support only those who are most in need. You can see an example of a headline here. That's kind of a typical right-wing response to this. So it is expensive. However, there are other things in society that are also very expensive as well. But is the welfare system more expensive than doing nothing for people in that situation as well? Because by not providing something for them, you also create other problems that can cost money, for example, crime and poverty and destitution. So you might produce an underclass by doing this, and it may be open to abuse. So some people might claim benefits they're not entitled to. Now, this is important, though. It's an argument to reform it and clamp down on fraud. It shouldn't be a case of not having welfare at all, because there are most people who genuinely need it. But again, the fraudsters should be looked into and how we actually deal with that situation. Now, another argument right-wing politicians will say is that if the state becomes too involved, then it becomes a nanny state. It interferes too much. So many right-wing politicians would say, we don't want to have lots of welfare state reforms because, again, the state is interfering too much. We want a smaller state, and we don't want to do that. Okay, and also you have the Marxist and left-wing criticisms. So the welfare softens the harshest effects of the capitalist system and gives an impression the system is less unjust than it really is. So Marxists might see welfare as a form of bribery. So it kind of cuts out the risk of a revolution happening. So it would be better if there was no welfare, because this would make the unjust nature of the system clear to everyone. So the Marxist idea would be, actually, let's not have welfare. You need to do a root and branch reform of the whole system, for example. And there are other ways to do this as well. So you may have progressive taxation. Yeah, the people who are taxed more if they're wealthier, and people who are taxed less if they are poorer. Subsidizing things, so giving discounts on certain things, and providing a state education as well. So there are other things here as well. You can set a minimum wage, so everyone can be paid at least a minimum, a fair wage for their work, and give equal opportunities to everyone within a society, depending on their gender, maybe their age, if they have a disability, and other particular things as well. So you can see here what the minimum wages are around the world. So certain countries who do have a minimum wage, this is what it would be. You also have other government agencies who support people in a vulnerable situation. And for example, Barnados here is a charity dealing with children and have particular children's homes. They spend about 200 million a year helping vulnerable children and young people. So government sometimes offers support to charities like this, but sometimes the government can't do everything, and there are gaps in government funding. They aren't able to solve particular problems, and so charities will have a particular focus like this as well. Okay, so a research task for you for next week is, again, to look on the internet, find out the main forms of welfare provided by the government in Qatar. So what are the systems of welfare, let's say, for Qatari citizens in Doha, which are universal and which are means tested? So that could be your task for next week. Okay, so let me know. Again, as always, if you have any questions, and we will go on to defining wealth and poverty next week.